Hello, class, and welcome back to our discussion of American history and the early republic. Today we're going to finish talking about the Jefferson administration. So, one of the first things that Jefferson has to deal with is a situation happening overseas in the Mediterranean um, that becomes known as the First Barbary War. Just to give you a little bit of background on this. So in North Africa, so today, present day, Morocco, Libya, um, that area, there was some states known as the Barbary states, and these were connected to the Ottoman Empire that were attacking European ships in the Mediterranean. And basically, what these European nations had done was reached an agreement with these Barbary states that they would pay them a tribute. So a tribute is a tax. And so these Europeans were paying a tribute to these Barbary states to prevent Barbary state-sponsored pirates from attacking their ships. So when the United States gets its independence from Great Britain, obviously it no longer falls under the protections of Great Britain and the tribute that Britain is paying. And so the Barbary pirates start attacking American ships. And of course, the expectation is that, this is extortion, that they'll attack our ships if we don't pay this tribute. And so the Barbary pirates want us to pay this tribute. And Jefferson refuses to do so. So Jefferson says, we're not going to pay the tribute. And instead, he deploys U.S. naval ships to support these merchant vessels. Right, so we're talking about merchant vessels, we're talking about trading ships, commercial ships, but he's going to use naval forces to protect these ships. And eventually what happens is one of these ships gets, it sort of crashes, and the sailors are taken prisoner, they're taken hostage by these Barbary pirates. And what typically happens is these people would be made into slaves. So when the Barbary pirates would capture a ship, they would obviously loot it and sell the prisoners into slavery. And so that's not going to work for Jefferson. So we have this war, and what ends up happening is there's naval battles taking place on the Mediterranean between the United States and these pirates. And I do need to mention the United States is not alone in this. Sweden and Sicily are helping us, fight these pirates. But so we have naval battles occurring on the Mediterranean, and also we have marine forces that land in North Africa and basically march on the city of Tripoli. All right, so Tripoli is in modern day Libya. At the time, this would have been Tripolitania. But our Marines march on take the city with the intention of overthrowing the government there, a guy known as the Pasha. And installing a new government. And obviously the ruler there, the Pasha, doesn't want that to happen, and so he sues for peace. And so peace is achieved between the United States and these Barbary pirates, where basically the U.S. agrees to pay a ransom to get those prisoners back, those sailors. So we're gonna pay them to get our men returned to us, but we will not pay a tribute, and therefore we will have U.S. ships would have safe passage in the Mediterranean. Now, this, just so we're clear, there will be a second Barbary War after Jefferson's administration. So we will deal with that later. Eventually, the U.S. will also win that second Barbary War, and from that point on, we won't have to worry about these pirates anymore. But right now, we just have a temporary peace after this first Barbary War. But more importantly, this is, for one, this is really our first foreign war. It's not an official war. There's no declaration of war made by Congress, but troops are deployed overseas. And we have success, which again sort of proves the effectiveness of the new nation under the new government. This war also demonstrates how important it is for us to have a standing Navy, which includes the Marine Corps. So we have an Army, all right, but a Navy is going to be important as well. So we're going to keep a United States Navy, which includes the Marine Corps. If you didn't know, the Marine Corps is a separate branch of the military, but it falls under the Department of the Navy. Probably the most significant thing that happens during the Jefferson administration, at least in terms of an event that Jefferson is responsible for, is the Louisiana Purchase. So a little background on that, all right? Last time I believe we talked about Louisiana, we were talking about the War for Independence, and we knew that that was Spanish Louisiana, right? After the French and Indian War, Louisiana became Spanish territory. But some things have changed, all right? So we have mentioned time and again that there is a revolution, or I should say revolutions, happening in France. And during this period of French revolutions, there eventually comes to power a man named Napoleon Bonaparte. And Napoleon ends up basically on a mission to take over Europe. Napoleon's famous for his wars in Europe, but he takes over Spain. And so Spain is now under Napoleon's control. And in fact, Napoleon makes his brother the king of Spain. And so in doing this, Louisiana reverts back to French control. So what was French Louisiana and then became Spanish Louisiana is now French Louisiana again. But in the meantime, as part of these revolutions that have happened, France has lost Haiti. All right, Haiti had its own revolution. We call it the Haitian Revolution, but it's really part of the bigger picture of these French revolutions. And so France has lost Haiti, but gained back Louisiana. Now, if you look at this map, you see that Louisiana is not the modern day state of Louisiana. It is a significant piece of the modern day United States. Basically stretches from New Orleans to Montana. So France has this. However, they've lost Haiti, and Haiti actually made more money for France than all of Louisiana. Remember, Louisiana, the primary thing that's happening out there is the fur trade. In Haiti, the primary thing that's being produced would be sugar. And so Haiti made a lot more money than Louisiana did. And now that's lost. At the same time, Napoleon is trying to take over Europe. And he's more concerned with Europe than he is with Louisiana. At the same time, if you recall, right, from our last section, we had a treaty with Spain called the Pinckney Treaty that allowed us to access the Mississippi River through New Orleans. Well, that has gone back to France. And so Jefferson approaches Napoleon. Remember, Jefferson is pro-France, okay? But Jefferson approaches Napoleon diplomatically about the possibility of paying Napoleon a few $1,000,000 for rights to New Orleans and the Mississippi. And Napoleon counteroffers Jefferson and says, if you will give us 15 million, then you can have Louisiana. And so Jefferson it's actually Congress who controls this, but through Jefferson's efforts, the United States purchases Louisiana. And of course, this is known as the Louisiana Purchase. So again, not the modern day state of Louisiana, but everything from New Orleans all the way to Montana, even a little bit into Canada. So this is 828,000 square miles for $15 million. That comes to about $18 per square mile, or 4 cents an acre. So this is, for one, it's a remarkable deal. But if you look at the map and you think of, you see the white there that represents Louisiana, everything to the right or to the east of that, it would have been the United States. So this purchase roughly doubles the size of the United States. So Jefferson doubled the size of the United States. Now, we bought this, but now we need to go see what we've purchased. So uh, Congress appropriates funds for something called the Corps of Discovery. The Corps of Discovery it exists from 1803 to 1806. It is basically a part of the U.S. Army. So it falls under the U.S. Army. It's operating under the U.S. Army. This Corps of Discovery is commanded by Meriwether Lewis. Meriwether Lewis is in command. The second in command is a man named William Clark. All right, so Lewis is in charge. Clark is second in command. Most people refer to this today as the Lewis and Clark expedition. All right, so Lewis and Clark. This is Lewis and Clark, Meriwether Lewis and William Clark. They are not alone, so they have obviously troops under them. They have, lots of sergeants and privates and things like that. In all total, there's going to be 45 members of this expedition. Okay, 45 members total. So we're not going to obviously talk about all 45 people, but Lewis and Clark are important. There's also a guy named York. York is the only black man on the expedition. He is actually William Clark's slave. So York is a slave of William Clark, who is part of this expedition. There is also a French man named Toussaint Charbonneau. Toussaint Charbonneau is who Lewis and Clark hire to be their guide. Remember, we've purchased this from France, and so there are some French fur trappers and things like that out there. So Toussaint Charbonneau is the guide of the Lewis and Clark expedition. However, he is not as important, at least not today, as his wife. And his wife was a Shoshone woman. And just a quick note on this, okay? There are two different ways that you hear people pronounce this lady's name, okay? Probably the most accurate pronunciation of her name is Sacagawea. However, most people more commonly call her Sacagawea. So Sacagawea or Sacagawea, we're talking about the same person. Okay, so she is the wife of Toussaint Charbonneau. She is a Shoshone woman. He likely won her or purchased her somehow. But she's really more important because she is the translator on this expedition. So she will communicate with these Indian tribes that they encounter. She's not only a language translator, but she's a cultural translator as well. And it probably wouldn't have been successful without her. But this takes 2 years. So these guys basically go from Missouri all the way to the Pacific Ocean and back. Remarkably, only one man died on the entire trip. So out of the 45 members, one person died. His name was Sergeant Charles Floyd, and he actually died from appendicitis. But this was really important, doubling the size of the United States. And their expedition, they wrote about all this stuff that they found. So new plants, new animals, things that were different in the West than there were back East. The reason we know so much about how many buffalo there were at the time were because of people writing about it during the Lewis and Clark expedition. Jefferson was fascinated by the West. He believed that there could be anything out there. He thought that there might be woolly mammoths still walking around out there. If you've ever been to Jefferson's house in Virginia called Monticello, when you come in his front door, his foyer, when you walk in the front door, he has all of his stuff from the Lewis and Clark expedition in that room. That's how important that was to him. Okay, here's a Supreme Court case that we need to discuss. This takes place during the Jefferson presidency. Now, in this course, every now and then we have to discuss a Supreme Court case. Here's what I want you to know, okay? When it comes to Supreme Court cases, the facts of the case are not as important as the outcome of the case, okay? when something makes it to the Supreme Court, because nothing starts in the Supreme Court, okay? So when something makes it to the Supreme Court, whatever opinion the Supreme Court gives has a lasting impact on American law, okay? So the only thing that can overturn a Supreme Court decision is another Supreme Court decision. All right. Therefore, whenever you learn about a Supreme Court case, it is more important to understand the opinion on the ruling of the case than the facts of the case. All right, but we'll talk about it. Okay, so this case is called Marbury versus Madison. This has been called the single most important decision in American constitutional law. All right, basically we're dealing with a man named William Marbury and James Madison. All right, so William Marbury is a federal judge, or he's supposed to be a federal judge, and James Madison is Jefferson's Secretary of State. So a little bit of background, right? As we know in the Constitution, the president appoints federal judges, okay? Nobody else can do it. The president of the United States appoints federal judges. Those judges then have to be confirmed by the Senate. And once they are confirmed, they serve for life, all right? So remember the election of 1800, okay? John Adams was the president, and he was a Federalist, okay? He loses the election to Jefferson. Jefferson is a Democratic Republican, so different political ideologies, right? Well, as president, as the sitting president of the United States, John Adams has the power to appoint federal judges, even though he has not been reelected. So the election has happened, and he's not going to be president much longer, but he technically still is until the day that Jefferson is sworn in. Adams is the acting president, and so Adams appointed a lot of federal judges in his sort of last days as president. And one of those federal judges was William Marbury. Now, of course, just appointing them is not enough. They have to be confirmed by the Senate, but a lot of them were. Okay, so William Marbury was appointed by Adams and confirmed by the Senate. However, before he could take his seat as judge, the inauguration of Jefferson happened. So now Jefferson is the president, and Marbury is still waiting to take his position as federal judge. Now, he's already been confirmed, but he hasn't taken the seat yet. The Secretary of State is supposed to do the final confirmation. Well, James Madison is now the Secretary of State. He's Jefferson's Secretary of State. And he says, well, I don't have to confirm this guy because he's from the last administration, and he's not on the seat. He hasn't taken his position as judge yet, so I don't have to do it. He missed the boat, so to speak. And so Marbury sues Madison, and this ends up going to the Supreme Court. Now, none of that really matters. Okay, here's why it matters. Well, all that matters is what the Supreme Court says. All right, and the Supreme Court, their decision, they say that they do not have the power to enforce any laws. Okay, what the Supreme Court says is they have the power to, quote, say what the law is. In other words, the Supreme Court has the power to interpret the Constitution. Okay, so the Supreme Court says their power is interpreting the Constitution, and therefore they have a right to say what laws are constitutional and are unconstitutional. We call this judicial review. So the idea that the Supreme Court can look at any law, state or federal, and say that law is unconstitutional. And once they say that law is unconstitutional, it's gone. It's over. Okay? Because they are the people who read the Constitution. Okay? So this decision, Marbury versus Madison, creates this idea, this power of judicial review. Basically, in their decision, the Supreme Court gives itself the power of judicial review and establishes the Constitution not just as a guiding set of principles, but as a law. All right, the Constitution is the law of the land. It's not an idea, it's not a suggestion, it is the law. All right. Now, this decision further helped define the separation of powers. You know, the legislative branch makes laws, the executive branch enforces laws, and the judicial branch interprets the law and can decide whether or not laws are unconstitutional. So, more important than the facts of Marbury and Madison is the idea that the Supreme Court can exercise judicial review. All right, the National Road. Okay, so this is the first major improved highway built by the federal government. Originally, this was called the Cumberland Road. In fact, if we were to go way back, all right, all the way back to 1755, when we were talking about the French and Indian War, and those guys, those British guys trying to take Fort Duquesne, and there was a man named Edward Braddock, and he was a British general, and he was trying to take his army to Fort Duquesne, and to do that, they had to basically build a road to bring all of his cannons and his wagons and all that stuff. And if you remember, they got attacked by Indians. It was called the Battle of Monongahela. It was a big failure. But that was called Braddock's Road. And Braddock's Road is actually sort of the beginning of the Cumberland Road, which becomes the National Road. So the first major improved highway built by the federal government. Now, this was authorized in 1806, so during the Jefferson presidency, Congress authorized the building of this road. Now, they didn't actually begin construction until 1811, which would have been during the next presidency, but it's kind of important. So what we're trying to do is connect the east to the west, all right, facilitate transportation, movement of goods and services and things like that. So the government is spending money to build this road. All right, another thing that happens during the Jefferson administration, all right, is the Embargo Act of 1807. Now, we've said it over and over and over again, but don't forget that this is happening during these French revolutions, okay? The French Revolution is definitely at this time in the early 1800s is the most significant event happening in the world. During this time, again, Napoleon is in charge of France, and he's trying to take over. He's basically trying to take over Europe, and so Napoleon is at war with Great Britain as well as other European nations. In fact, there's this entire coalition of European powers trying to defeat Napoleon. And so what's happened is Napoleon and France, which is under Napoleon, and Britain have both declared any nation that trades with the other to be enemies. So anybody trading with France is an enemy of Great Britain. Anybody trading with Great Britain is an enemy of France. And so obviously this is problematic for the United States because we're trying to stay neutral, and we don't want to be an enemy of either. And so the Embargo Act basically forbids American ships from leaving and trading with these other nations, which could potentially be seen as false neutrality or anything like that. And so this causes a few problems. One, it's going to cause an economic recession because we can't trade effectively. The other thing is people are going to be critical of the government. Now, Jefferson, remember, he was an advocate of small government, but he would have had to have signed this law. And a lot of people saw this as government overreach, the fact that they could tell you what to do with private business as far as ships leaving and things like that. But another consequence of this Embargo Act, because we couldn't trade with these other industrialized nations like Britain or France, is that the United States now has to really focus on developing its own industry. And so this helped spur along American manufacturing, which is really important. Okay, so the last thing we're going to talk about in this video is the Industrial Revolution. Now, this is a very significant topic. We will be talking about industry from now until the end of this section. because of the important role it plays in leading to the eventual split of the United States. All right, so let's talk about what the Industrial Revolution is very briefly. All right, it is basically replacing human and animal labor with machines. All right, so human and animal labor being replaced by machine labor. Now, obviously, all of that's not going to happen overnight. All right, there will be phases to it. You invent one machine that does one task, everything else still done by hand. And then you find another machine that can do another part of the task, and everything else is done by hand, right? Now, the Industrial Revolution begins in Great Britain in 1760, okay? It is very important to remember that the Industrial Revolution began in Great Britain. That is significant, all right? You need to remember that, all right, over the next several videos, okay? Also, if you look at the time, 1760, so the United States, when did we say the American Revolution began? Well, not the War for Independence, but the Revolution. It's hard to say. You could argue maybe 1763. That's really when benign neglect ends, but you could even take that back into the French and Indian War when the British first arrived here in the mid 1750s. So it's very interesting. It is almost too strange to be a coincidence that the American Revolution and the Industrial Revolution coincide, and that the Industrial Revolution is a British thing. It's something that begins in Britain while the United States is part of the British Empire. But all of this is interconnected, okay? So the Industrial Revolution and the American Revolution happening together, all right, with the key focal point being Britain and its colonies, all right? So keep that in mind, okay? Now, so we said that human and animal labor are being replaced by machines. So initially these were water-powered machines, so machines that were powered by moving water, running water, things like rivers. But eventually when they figure out how to use coal to make steam power, all right, then steam energy will take over. Now, the first items that are sort of focused on as part of the Industrial Revolution are textiles. Textiles is cloth, all right, turning plant fibers and animal fibers into yarn or thread, and then turning that into fabric, which will make clothes and things like that. Textiles, and then of course iron being a building block of the Industrial Revolution. Now, very early, people were actually doing some of this stuff at their homes, but very quickly they started creating factories, and people were doing these things in factories. So steam-powered factories. Now, this is important, okay? This is something you need to know from this point forward all the way through the section. It needs to linger in the back of your mind that industry and slavery do not go together, okay? Industry is connected to the idea of free labor. When I say free, I don't mean you don't pay wages. I mean free as in they're free, as in you do pay them wages, all right? Free as in not slaves, okay? The Industrial Revolution is connected to the idea of free labor, all right? So slavery and industry cannot coexist, all right? That's important. Where did industry begin? Great Britain. Guess what the first nation was to go against slavery? The first anti-slavery nation. It was Great Britain. Those two things are connected. When industry shows up, slavery goes away. That's very important to remember that, okay? So let's see what happens, right? The northern states embrace industry, all right? Now, part of that is simply geography, all right? The rivers and the topography and the people who settled in the north, again, it's one of these things that are almost too strange to be a coincidence, but the northern half of the United States was well suited for industry. That's where the coal was, that's where the iron was, and so industry it fit naturally into the northern states. Okay. Now, in the meantime, remember the important, if we're talking about what are we making? Industry is making stuff. What is it that we're making? Well, it's textiles. Textile is the first real product of industrialized manufacturing. Well, what are textiles made out of? Well, they can be made out of flax, which is linen. They can be made out of wool, which comes from sheep, or they can be made out of cotton, which comes from a cotton plant, right? Well, out of those things, guess which one tends to grow well in the South? Okay, cotton. So the North is, by strange circumstance, perfectly suited for industry. And it also happens to be the region where they've already gotten rid of slavery. Meanwhile, in the South, where they've kept slavery, turns out that cotton grows in the South. And so we had this weird circumstance. If the United States had been further north on the map on the globe, or further south on the globe, this could have been completely different. But the United States falls perfectly on the globe, where half of it is suited to grow cotton and make, which would be grown for these textiles, and half of it's suited for industry. Okay, so and remember, we said that in the industrial revolution, not everything happens at once. So one aspect of production gets industrialized, everything else is still done the old way by human labor and animal labor. So in the North, they figured out how to manufacture thread and fabric through mechanization. But in the South, land still has to be cleared by hand. It still has to be tilled by hand. It still has to be planted by hand. It still has to be picked by hand. And so the South's very much going to remain agrarian, all right, agricultural. Now, this is where this guy Eli Whitney comes into play. Eli Whitney is significant. And if you're listening to this video, I can almost guarantee you've heard of Eli Whitney before now. You probably learned about Eli Whitney when you were in elementary school, and you probably learned that Eli Whitney invented the cotton gin, and all of that's true, okay? But if we were to go back in time, Eli Whitney would have been famous not for inventing the cotton gin, at least not yet. He was already famous because of the American model of industry. He created the American model of industry based on an idea of interchangeable parts. All right. So what Eli Whitney first did was he invented a type of gun. Okay. Prior to Eli Whitney, guns were made by gunsmiths. All right. Whenever you hear that word smith, that is someone who is a skilled worker. He is a craftsman. He's a master of his craft. So, for example, Paul Revere was a silversmith. He could make stuff out of silver. A blacksmith made stuff out of iron. A goldsmith would make things out of gold, right? Gunsmiths made guns, but every gun that a gunsmith made was an individual. A gunsmith made every single gun different. Okay, now there might be certain characteristics that were indicative of this gunsmith or that gunsmith, but each gun was unique. All right. The parts of that gun were built specifically for that gun. What Eli Whitney did was he made guns where each of the parts fit a parameter of specifications. All right, today you might be familiar with the term like mil spec. Mil spec means military specifications, right? Meaning for this part to meet mil spec, it has to meet these specifications. What Eli Whitney did was he made guns that were fit certain specifications, and therefore if the hammer broke on gun A, you could replace it with the hammer from gun B. These were interchangeable parts, and this made the guns cheaper because rather than being all individuals where every part had to be made specifically for that gun, And therefore, if a part broke, the gunsmith had to make an entirely new part specific to that gun. You could keep parts in stock and replace them easily, all right, interchangeable parts. It's what Eli Whitney did, created the American model of manufacturing. Now, eventually he creates this thing called the cotton gin. Why does the cotton gin matter, right? So we know that the North is embracing industry. We know that they want to make textiles. We know that you can make them out of cotton, all right? We also know that the South can grow cotton, but here's the catch, okay? The South actually can't grow cotton the way we think it does, all right? The cotton that grew in the South was what was called short staple cotton, okay? There were a few exceptions. The coast of Georgia, the coast of South Carolina could grow the good cotton. The good cotton was called long staple cotton. But most of the South could only grow what was called short staple cotton. Basically, what you're dealing with when you have cotton, when you pull a cotton ball, if you've ever handled raw cotton, you'll know that the white fluffy part is full of seeds. And you can't make thread or yarn or fabric out of cotton unless those seeds are removed. Well, because the South is still using human and animal labor, all right, those seeds had to be removed by hand, by a human being picking the seeds out. These are obviously going to be slaves that are doing this. Well, even though you don't pay slaves, there's still a cost of having slaves. Okay, slaves don't get paid a wage, but you do have to buy the slaves. You have to house the slaves. You have to feed the slaves. You have to clothe the slaves, because slaves are still human beings and they have to be provided for. It's an investment to purchase slaves. And if you have a plantation, you're going to have hundreds of slaves. All right. So what would end up happening is, if you could only grow the short staple cotton, then you may have a field full of cotton, but the slaves, when it comes time to pick the seeds out, that process would slow down the production of cotton so much that you would actually lose money. You could not make money off of cotton in the South if it was short staple cotton. The only cotton you could make money off of was long staple cotton, and that only grew in a very few select areas. Eli Whitney fixes this problem by inventing the cotton gin. The cotton gin takes out the human labor of the equation of cotton production when it comes to picking out the seeds. So rather than a person taking their hand and trying to pick the seeds out of the cotton, you drop the raw cotton with seeds in the cotton gin and you turn it, and the fibers, the white fiber that you make cloth out of, will be separated from the seeds themselves. You actually see a picture of that here. So this was a revolutionary piece of equipment because it mechanized pulling the seeds out of the cotton. We replaced quote unquote human labor with machine labor. Now, that's good. Here's the problem. By doing that, Eli Whitney made short staple cotton profitable. Now you can make money off short staple cotton as long as you have a cotton gin. The issue is that is the only part of cotton production at the time that had been replaced by machine, meaning the land still had to be cleared by hand. The land still had to be tilled by hand. The cotton had to be planted by hand. The cotton had to be tended by hand. The cotton had to be picked by hand. Okay? So now the northern states have industrialized. They have factories that can turn this cotton into thread and fabric. So the North is going to have a demand for cotton. The South now has fields that can grow the inferior cotton and still make money. So they have a demand to grow cotton. Cotton becomes the king of the U.S. economy. The North thrives off cotton. The South thrives off cotton. But the only aspect of cotton production before it's turned into textiles that is mechanized is removing the seeds. Everything else still has to be done the old way. which is using slave labor. All right, so what this does is it doesn't end slavery. This now makes it where the South wants to keep slavery. This strengthens the South's hold on slavery. So the North is moving away from slavery. The North is now embracing industry. The North has already rejected slavery, but now they're on a path further and further away from it because of industry. The South, meanwhile, is now grasping it stronger than ever, because now it is not just part of the economy, it is the economy. It's vital to the economy. And so we have now hit a fork in the road. All right, now picture a fork. If you have a fork in the road, you know, a Y, okay? If you're looking at a Y, all right, when you first get to that fork and the fork starts to split in two directions, at the beginning, they're not that far apart. But as you continue down those two paths, you get further and further apart, right? So if you're traveling up the Y and you're on the part that's just one, you're heading in the same direction. That would be like America in the American Revolution. But then when you hit that fork in the road, where the North turns away from slavery and starts to embrace industry, and the South, meanwhile, maintains slavery and maintains the old way, all right? When they first hit the fork, they're not that far apart from each other. But as they continue down those separate paths, they're going to continue further and further away from each other as they pursue their own directions. This is critical in understanding how we go from this strongly united country in 1800 to a strongly divided country in 1860. The root of it is here, okay? Now, because of the American Revolution, because people were starting to question slavery, certain things had happened, right? We already know that, I've already mentioned to you that Britain is going to be the first anti-slavery nation because Britain is the first industrialized nation. We know that the northern states are going to become anti-slavery because they have embraced industry. But there were other things happening before. For example, Virginia was the first slave state to stop the importation of slavery. This actually happened in 1778. So 1778, we're still fighting the War of Independence. Thomas Jefferson, who at that time was not the president, at 1778, Thomas Jefferson was a Virginia legislator. He's the guy who really said, hey, we need to stop bringing slaves. Remember, Jefferson, he's sort of a paradox of an individual because he is a slave owner, but he's the guy who writes that all men are created equal. Okay, he is really the man who gets Virginia to stop importing slaves from Africa. So that happens, right? Then in the Slave Trade Act of 1794, so this would have been during George Washington's presidency. George Washington is also a slave owner. He's another paradox because he is a slave owner, yet he orders the freedom of his slaves upon his death. But here, he signs the Slave Trade Act of 1794, which prohibits building or outfitting ships for the purpose of slave trading. All right, and then in 1808, all right, Congress passes the act prohibiting the importation of slaves, which Jefferson signs. So Jefferson signed the legislation that ended the Atlantic slave trade for the United States, which means no more slaves will be brought from Africa to the United States. All right, the Atlantic slave trade is over as far as the United States is concerned. And really, to be honest, as far as the world is concerned, because Great Britain, remember Great Britain, first industrialized nation, also the first anti-slavery nation. Great Britain has also said that no slaves will be taken from Africa and transported. And even though Britain technically shouldn't be able to tell the world what to do, Britain has a powerful navy, and they basically make a statement that any ships transporting slaves will be considered pirates, and of course the British Navy will sink pirates when they find them. Um, so Britain has outlawed the Atlantic slave trade, but the United States and our own government has outlawed the Atlantic slave trade. So it would seem from the Declaration of Independence until 1808, we were sort of on the path to getting rid of slavery. Slavery was sort of on the way out. Half the states have outlawed it. Even the southern states are not importing slaves anymore. And so it seems that slavery would soon fizzle out, except the Industrial Revolution in the North, combined with the demand for cotton in the South, has now made slavery vital to the economy. And so there are people who have questioned. Now, you can't say what if in history. We can't do that. We don't know what would have happened. But if Eli Whitney had not invented the cotton gin, would slavery have ended in America sooner than it actually did? Possibly. Okay, we don't know because it obviously didn't happen that way. But you could also say if Eli Whitney had never invented the cotton gin, the United States might not have ever become a powerful nation. And again, we don't know, but this cotton economy, this marriage between the northern industry and southern agriculture, both centered around cotton, propels the United States to sort of the front of the world when it comes to manufacturing. The United States becomes we go from not being a nation to being a relatively very important nation in the world's economy because of our cotton production. All right, so there's sort of an irony here when it comes to the cotton gin and slavery. Obviously, we're not done talking about this. We will be talking about this for the next several videos, so please do not forget this. All right, keep all of this stuff that we've talked about in the last few slides in the back of your mind. All right, the last thing we'll mention, it's really just tied to the Industrial Revolution, is the North River Steamboat, also sometimes called the Claremont. This was basically the first steam-powered commercial vessel built in 1807. So again, during Jefferson's presidency. This revolutionized sea travel, the idea that a ship could be steam powered. Before this, you basically had two options. You could put up the sails and hope the wind was blowing in the right direction, or you could use poles and paddles and things like that. Because this was a river boat, all right, rivers flow in one direction. So rivers are great for travel in one direction down the river. Going upriver, a little bit more difficult because upriver you're fighting the current. So basically you would have to have men with poles push the boat up the river. But steam, again, replacing human labor with machine labor, the steam engine can propel these vessels, and steam engine, steam powered vessels will become very important in the world after this. All right, so that's it for this video. We covered some important topics. We will continue talking about the early republic and the antebellum period in the next video. Thank you.